now are becoming involved at all levels. I was on the Status of Women Committee before I came to this committee. And I would say that women were probably the first victims of changes in this government's policies. All groups that advocate for rights and all those groups that promote rights seem to be the first victims here. It looks like, well, I would say that I'm quite shocked and angry about what's happening. This doesn't reflect my values. I think my values are being taken away. I think that in Canada there are supposed to be values of fairness and justice and equality. And what I see now is a complete change of direction. And we as citizens don't see ourselves in this change in direction. Now we have a crisis in rights and democracy. And over time, this organization has acquired a good reputation, a strong reputation, an international reputation. How are people abroad perceiving what's happening here now with this crisis?
The last 3 months in London, England, and I came back just for this hearing, and I'll be returning. And I can tell you, coming through London, there are not, in addition to a number of international NGOs, there are government people from, I'm not going to exaggerate the number, but from personal contacts and media people, and I can tell you the reputation of Canada, and what hurts me is the reputation of the centre is going down. People are aware of the centre internationally, people who are concerned, not everyone, I don't want to distort this, but those who are concerned about human rights abroad are very much aware of the history of the centre and its particular role. And it has spread throughout the globe, literally now, in the NGO community and to governments, Scandinavian governments and others, who are sensitive on human rights matters about what's happening to rights and democracy. And there is very real concern.
Well, with respect to the first part of your question, there seems to be a pattern emerging in various organizations, not just rights and democracy. I'm also affiliated with Kairos. I look at Aboriginal issues. And for several months, similar problems have occurred.
Of a case regarding Aboriginal peoples before the Canadian Human Rights Commission, which is being delayed and delayed over and over with respect to Aboriginal children. So your comments, I find, are ringing true, that this, what's happening at Rights and Democracy is happening in other places as well with respect to women's organizations and so on. With respect to international comment, it's interesting, you know, David Matas in his famous statement on Ezra Lamant's blog accused those who made the grants to these three groups in the Middle East of being ignorant. It was very condescending, his language, ignorant of what is going on in the Middle East. In other words, they didn't know what they were doing. Recently, about 3 or 4 weeks later, we had a statement made by Bet Salem, by the leader of Bet Salem, saying that those at Rights and Democracy who had repudiated the grants, they were the ones that were ignorant of what was really going on in Israel and in the Middle East. And so then there was also a statement signed by about 6 or 7 or more human rights organizations in Israel and the Palestinian territories criticizing the decision. There was a letter signed by over 100 lawyers and professors in Canada condemning the situation. There was Mr. Shabas, who's head of the human rights, who's a Canadian, but now head of the human rights body in Ireland. So there's already been a lot of comment internationally about this, and it's certainly not helping our reputation as a human rights organization.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move back over to Mr. Abbott for 7 minutes. Mr. Allmand, I always like to try and find common ground with people, and I think you and I are in agreement on Section 7, Bracket 2, on the necessity to consult. I'll read it again. All appointments to the board shall be made after consultation by the minister with the Leader of the Opposition and the Leader of every other recognized party in the House of Commons. So we should put on the record that Mr. Ignatieff, Mr. Duceppe, and Mr. Layton approved all of the directors who are on the board of directors. And for them to be sitting there wiping their hands and saying, oh, we didn't have anything to do with it, is really quite an amazing sight. However, I do have a question for you. You seem to have a bit of a fixation with Mr. Matus. What is it? I don't quite understand. You're suggesting that Mr. Matus is a lapdog of the Prime Minister, that he's parroting the kind of things that this evil Conservative government might be trying to propagate. Is that what you're trying to say?
On your first point first, the fact that the leaders of the opposition parties were consulted doesn't mean they approved. I don't know what their reaction was when they were consulted. So I'm not sure how they responded to the Prime Minister when he approached each one of them. It's true that he has to consult, but I don't know what the response was, whether they approved or not. The appointment power is still left in the hands of the Order in Council, of the Prime Minister and the Order in Council. So whether they disapproved or approved, I don't know. And maybe you could ask them, we could find out how they responded to the consultation. With respect to Mr. Matus, Mr. Matus was on the board previously when I was the president, and at that time he was a constructive member of the board, although he, even at that time, on occasion seemed to be more interested in apologizing for the as an apologist for the State of Israel than for human rights in the world, but not as extreme as he is now. But when I read, Mr. Abbott, his long, and he sent me a copy, that long statement that he made, which was on Ezra Levant's blog on the internet. It's full of attacks on the UN, on the UN Human Rights Council, on NGOs. I was surprised at his very strong attack on human rights NGOs, on many things. I mean, it would take me a whole meeting and maybe an hour to respond to all the points he has in letters, but that's the difference between, I have no personal differences with Mr. Matus, but it's the statement that he made, which shows that his main concern is protecting the State of Israel from any criticism, whether deserved or not. And I just can't agree with that. And also, more or less supporting this concept that if you criticize Israel, you're anti-Semitic, which I find really ridiculous.
If we could go politician to politician here for just half a second, I find it really quite breathtaking that you would be attacking a person who, by his own submissions to this committee, called himself a prairie liberal, and we also know that he is a Nobel Peace Prize nominee. I find that really quite breathtaking.
Well, you know, he was a liberal candidate, but that doesn't, you know, that says nothing about his bias with respect to the State of Israel. He has got this extreme bias. For example, in the Durban 1 conference, he walked out before the government conference even started, whereas Erwin Cutler stayed and fought the battle to make sure that the government conference came out with a proper declaration which was correct. It's the fact that he's a liberal or not a liberal has nothing to do with it. It's his bias on this particular issue, and it's the same bias with the whole 7 of these people, as far as I can see, that's causing the problem.
I suggest to you, gentlemen, that you are bringing partisan politics into this issue, and it is unbecoming, because after all, this is supposed to be a nonpartisan organization.
Well, let me answer that. You asked a question to the previous witnesses in which you put forward, you said, isn't the board supposed to make the policy for the organization? That's right, but the policy that they make has to respect the governance imperative that I referred to, which is total respect for the International Bill of Human Rights. You can't make policy or do things which are outside the mandate, which is in Section 4 and following. So yes, you can make policy, but it has to be policy which